Welcome to Rocket Ship, the home of epic React Native content. I'm Simon Grimm, creator of Galaxies.dev, and today's guest is Rory Bain, product engineer at Incident.io, and I found Rory through a cool article he wrote about the OnCall application. So, Rory, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm really looking forward to talk to you because the article you had was not behind the flame. That was also an interesting post about yourself, but about building a multi-platform on-call mobile app where you really went deep into like technology selection, problems with Expo managed flow, CI/CD, debugging. Really a lot of interesting things. Also, I think about mono repositories. So we can hopefully cover all of that a bit in your experience today. But first of all, what is your React Native or mobile background, and also what is your current job at Incident.io?
Sure. I guess I've come from it I originally worked on native mobile apps. I think people seem to come from, I guess, the website quite often or from a native side and have different experiences through that. I first worked on native mobile apps for sort of 3 or 4 years across a couple of companies before I worked at a company called FanDuel, who originally were a fancy sports product at the time, and around when I left were a more sports betting focused product. But at FanDuel, I worked on their sort of first React Native experience, and that was like taking our existing app and looking at how could we sort of stop writing the same code 3 times and look at using React Native to optimize and ship quicker. That was really fun because it was like both the product that we were building was cool. It was like we built a bingo game for the Super Bowl at the time, and it was like sort of a month of building and just seeing like what can we do in a month, and a very hard deadline because they're not moving the Super Bowl for us. So we did something that was I don't know if it was novel at the time. I'm sure a lot of people were doing it, but we built a sort of abstraction above React Native so that we were working across iOS, Android, and web. And that wasn't using like React Native Web. That was, I guess, it might have existed, but in its early days at the time. But we built like our own abstraction, just relying.
I think
on,
you said it was 2018.
Yeah, I think around that time. I guess 2018, probably February 2018, the Super Bowl that year. So we used it then, and I enjoyed it enough. It was my first experience writing JavaScript, and then shortly after TypeScript as well. So there's like all the things of learning a new language as well as like learning the platform and whatnot. But after that, I worked briefly, I worked for 2.5 years at a company called Freetrade, which is like an investing app, a bit like Robinhood, if you're familiar with that. That was a native app, so I was kind of like off React Native for quite a while, and worked on both the iOS and Android app, which was interesting. It was the first time I'd worked on in earnest in an Android app. But it wasn't until I came to Incident, where I've been here for just actually 2 years last week. And we were the first company I've worked at where we just didn't have a mobile app, and I was like, I'm going to go do something slightly different. I think through starting in native, going into React Native, I had sort of changed. I went from being like a very mobile developer to doing like, I can do a bit of React now, I can do a bit of TypeScript, and like you sort of just steadily like flow out into other things. So at this point, I was like, I've done a bit of everything. I did quite a lot of backend at Freetrade, and I was like, I'll go and just not work on mobile for a while. That'll be like a good learning experience. Not really thinking that halfway through my time at Incident, our CTO Pete would come to me and be like, we kind of need a mobile app. So that sort of spawned I guess what is the start of my blog post, which is like, we need a mobile app. Like, we have a completely blank slate. How do we want to go into this?
Yeah. So we'll definitely get into the whole idea of that app and everything. But first, I've looked at Incident a couple of times over the past, and like I'm a solo developer and I'm not really part of a big company or anything, so I don't really know exactly what Incident is actually about. Could you like explain what Incident does and like where it helps?
Yeah, of course. So Incident is like originally like an incident response tool that was sort of designed to help when things do go wrong, like helping coordinate responding to that. And like in our early days, that was like helping you get the right people into a Slack channel and coordinating like who does what stuff needs to happen. Not long after that, it was like then looking more at like what you do after the incident is done and like how can you improve on this? How can you write up and debrief on it? A large thing that I've been working on for the past year or so, and part of the mobile app I've been working on, is our on-call part of the product. And that is like taking, originally it was like you've been alerted and now you use our tool. Whereas now this is like doing the full thing. So like the end-to-end experience of actually getting paged, being on an on-call schedule, setting up like escalation paths that define who you should page when certain things happen for different parts of your product and whatnot. We now sort of focus on like the whole end-to-end experience and trying to make that like a very good and human experience, which I think is like our differentiator a lot of the time. Is other tools that I've used like this, it feels a lot like you're just like a human webhook that you're just being like hit over and over again with blobs of data that don't really mean that much. And we really focused on like, you're a person who's on call who needs time off, and we want to make that easy for you to arrange, and sort of focusing on the human and the communication aspects of it.
So how did the on-call app start? Is it like all the great apps that start with a little internal hackathon? Is that the right read?
yeah, that's exactly it. Actually, is
it's always the same.
It's always that. It's funny because I think we went into it like we had some time coming up for a hackathon, and we'd sort of floated the idea of doing React Native, and it was like, oh, this might be a good chance to do this, and you're sort of telling yourself beforehand, we're going to do it and then we'll throw that out and we'll start fresh. But I think it always comes to the fact that afterwards you're like, we could just change this and make it the actual app. So we did a hackathon, I think, for 2 days, and we used very much like the Expo Go app. We did very little customization. It was just like focusing on something that we could put up in a slideshow at the end of it and show people like, hey, this is what this looks like, which was quite fun.
Did you, in the article you outlined, by the way, the article will be linked below, of course, the podcast. You also outlined the other technologies. Why did you straight go for React Native? I mean, Flutter is very popular as well, or Kotlin Multiplatform comes up from time to time. Why React Native?
I think that there's a few reasons. So one thing we did is people in the company had sort of biases based on their past experiences or people that they knew. And we wanted to sort of like exercise those and like think it through a little bit before diving in on any one. So I had some connections, like people I knew at FanDuel who'd now been. So after I left FanDuel, they actually had a React Native project, a greenfield one that is part of their larger like sports betting product, which is like, by some metrics, like one of the biggest apps in the US now. So I was like, I sort of reached out and was like, you've been doing this for a few years now, how's it going? And my old manager, Liam, there, very kindly like jumped on a call and just told me all the stuff that is great, good and bad about it. And I think they were building that sort of before Expo was like the default way. So he was like, if I was doing it again, I'd use Expo, I'd do this. And I was like, cool, that's good to know. And we also we chatted to another few people, some like very kind people came into the office and chatted to us. Like loads of people got put in touch. So we had a lot of people saying it was good. But that being said, like it's hard to know for sure. So I had actually explored Kotlin Multiplatform at Free Trade a little bit because that fitted our problem very well. Is like we wrote Swift code, we wrote Kotlin code. Oftentimes you would end up with this business logic layer of your applications that just was almost identical. Mm-hmm. Like if you've written much Swift or Kotlin, you're like looking at it sometimes and you could like squint and it's pretty much the same code. And we tried to write it with that in mind. Like we would have engineers write the iOS part of a feature and then the same engineer would go and write the Android part of a feature, just so that like it was fresh in your mind. The patterns were very much the same. It would be very easy to write. So we kind of explored Kotlin Multiplatform, and when I looked at it at Free Trade, it was just like very early days still. Like there was only really 2 or 3 big companies using it. I think there's that thing of like you don't want to be the biggest company using a technology. Oftentimes anyway, I don't think it's always the wrong approach, but it's a gamble if you are.
Yeah.
So we were kind of like, React Native feels quite good. Kotlin Multiplatform, even when I looked at it today, I think still looked a little immature. And I think one thing that put me off is still just like native compile times, build tooling. I find is quite tricky. And I'm not saying like that web-based tooling is actually like the Garden of Eden. It's not like an amazing place, but I think it's an area where I'm quite comfortable now. I think a lot of other people at Incident are quite comfortable and like have some experience in. So it was like, we don't have to introduce all this new tooling that we don't understand. People don't have to go and set all that up. Something that maybe we can talk about a bit later is like, we use a managed Expo project, which means all of our engineers here don't necessarily need to install Android Studio or Xcode. They can work on a mobile app without doing any of that, which is, I think, hard to like understate how good that is. And then I guess the final option I've not talked about at all is Flutter. One thing I to be honest, I didn't like go and try Flutter in earnest. Like, I think having used Flutter projects, I feel that I think just the way that the technology works is just doesn't quite jive with the way that I think a lot of people here want to build applications, which is with Flutter you end up like writing dark code. Never mind that that's like a language to learn. I'm sure it's like easy enough to learn, but the ultimate way that things end up getting rendered is you have an app that just does things quite different to the rest of your device. And in some contexts that's absolutely fine. Like, it gets your product out there, and who cares if like a button animation is slightly different, or you can't quite swipe to go back in the same way, or like subtle things like that. But I think particularly with our target audience as well, of like a lot of our users are developers and are very like aware of this stuff. I think people expect like a certain level of like the way things work, and for an app to feel at home on the platform when it's on. You can certainly do that badly with a native app and within a React Native app, but I think like hopefully if you like stay within the sort of guardrails that are provided for you, you can get like a really nice feeling app that feels native, feels like what the user's used to, without having to, I don't know, jump through hoops or do anything slightly unusual.
Yeah, definitely. I had a video a couple of weeks ago about like Flutter with React Native, outlining some of the main parts, and I mean, yeah, there are like slight performance differences maybe, but React Native has a new architecture coming, so all of that kind of balances out. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to that React Native is rendering these native controls, while Flutter is just like pixel perfect drawing stuff. And this is not inherently a bad thing. Like, if you look at it from the perspective of, I don't want my app to change on different platforms, I want it to look exactly the same on all platforms, then Flutter is probably the best choice for you. Or if you do like, I think Theo said this, somewhere be closer to a game, like maybe not a game with Unity, but like close to a game. Or there's this one app which has like really fancy animations when you scroll and like super custom stuff. Flutter is a great choice for these applications because of the performance. But yeah, it's funny how you used like React Native in 2018, where it was like, I don't know, did you feel comfortable in 2018 using React Native? How did you feel back then? Do you remember?
I felt okay about it. I think at the time it was very much still the performance is just not going to be the same. And I don't recall having performance issues at the time, to be honest. And I think it's a thing now where like you can certainly have performance issues. I had an incident just yesterday where someone reported our Android app was just like weirdly slow on their device. So I don't think it's maybe not solved, but I don't think it has enough sway to be something that is worth, changing path completely and dropping a whole technology that has a bunch of other benefits for.
Yeah, I had a previous guest, Alex Moreau, who developed the Flashlight application to inspect your React Native apps. I think he told me I should always test on a cheap Android phone. That's like the best way to ensure that the performance of your app is good.
Yeah, I'll be honest. The incident I had yesterday, the user reported it, and then they told me the phone they were using, and I was like, "What?" It's a phone I just never heard of, and I was like, "Okay, I'll see what I can do on the phones that we have to hand, but I'm not sure I'm going to get that specific one."
Yeah, just like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I learned that there's a Huawei App Store, because those devices don't have access to the Google Play App Store, so they have their own Huawei App Stores where you can upload like an APK sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
That's quite funny.
Funny things going on, yeah. So, OnCall app, you developed in 2 days within the hackathon, like the bare minimum project, and got something that everyone is excited about, I guess.
Yeah.
How did you then proceed? You said you had a managed project with Expo. Did you keep it like that all the time? And like, how have you been able to like get your other developers on board?
Sure. So yeah, we did the hackathon with I think Expo Go the whole time, and just like made use of that to at least do a proof of concept. When it came to like as we got further on with building the rest of OnCall, we got to a point where we were like we built most of the sort of back end infrastructure that supports a lot of it, and it was like we were getting text when you get paged, and we were kind of like it'd be really useful if you actually got a push notification in your app to actually feel like this product was real at this point. So we originally had planned to do the mobile app quite a bit later because you could argue that you can use an on-call product without the app, but when we were trying it, we're like the experience just isn't quite there. So let's pull this forward. We'll jump on it now. We started work on that. One of the first things that entailed was setting up push notifications properly, and like that is one of the first points you're going to hit where like suddenly you can't use Expo Go because of the way your push certificates and things are set up in that app. So you need to go and set up a new app. And I think before we even started work on the hackathon, I chatted to Caddy at Expo, and she'd sort of explained having a managed Expo app to me, and I was like, I kind of get it, but I also like don't in practice. Like I don't know, it just didn't compute in my head until I actually had to go and do it. But what we ended up doing is like fully opting into that process. And the main reason for that was like I was saying earlier, is you can effectively end up with an app that nobody ever needs to build the native side of on their computer. Like since we started working on this app, I've created the Android or iOS directories maybe 3 times, and like they're not checked into Git. They're just like ephemeral, generated as you need them using config. But like nobody actually can see that code. And I think all of those have been in Android. I don't think I've ever had to do it on iOS. And like having built a lot of different iOS apps previously, like my first job as an agency where we do like app after app after app, you become quite familiar with some of the like pain points and processes around managing that. And it's so many things that we just haven't had to deal with the incident that it's so nice that Expo manage for you. And it's things like push certificates, it's code signing, it's notification entitlement. So a big part of an on-call app is getting push notifications that make your phone make a noise, which sounds simple in principle. And on iOS, it is fairly simple, to be honest. It's just setting a certain flag on your Xcode project. On Android, that is quite complex because it's not supported natively by the system. So that was actually one of the only places where we had to sort of exit out of doing things using React Native and do some native module writing. And when I was first doing the Expo Manage stuff, or when Caddy was explaining it to me, she was kind of like, you can still write native code, but you never like check it in. I was like, how does that work? But once I got into it, it was actually very simple. Expo have like pretty good docs. I think there was some stuff that I felt was a bit missing when we first picked it up, but I see they're updating this stuff all the time and improving it all the time. So you sort of follow a wizard that generates you a project which just gives you enough for a single like Xcode package or a single like Android Studio, and the package is the wrong word, but like a Gradle dependency that you can install into your Android project. And then you write your code in there, push it up to Expo, and they generate like the original project and then install your package into it. So every time we commit to develop, if there's like changes around that stuff, we'll get a new development like simulator wrapper app that you can use to work on. And this is all a long way of saying, like, if you want to add stuff to our mobile app, you don't need to do like most of the hard work. One thing that is a bit annoying still is if you are an iOS user, you need to whitelist your device on the distribution profile. So, if you want to run the actual app on your phone, you need to have like a list of devices that you bake into the IP that you give to people. And annoyingly, like that means you have to tell people before they ever start working in the app, you're like, add your phone here, because otherwise it's going to take a while when you go to do it. And it's one of those things like I'm reminding people to do every so often in case they ever do need to work in the mobile app. But you're sort of beholden to Apple at that point, and they're like, they say it'll be a few hours, but sometimes it can be a day or two to actually process. But ignoring that part, it's like if I want to work on our mobile app, it's honestly as simple as like running a React app. You like go into the mobile directory, you clone it or whatever, you run yarn start, you get given a QR code to download a build on Expo, which is like our customized version of Expo Go, effectively, which has our push certificates, our native modules, and all that stuff. You scan another QR code, which is like connects you to the dev server, and like you're off, and you get like hot reloading, and you get everything. And that experience has been like so good. And I don't think another technology could have really like competed with that. So like super happy with that. I had a friend that was working on a Flutter app, who I had been sort of preaching React Native to a bit. I was like, wow, this stuff is so good. I could, like, having worked on it 6 years ago at this point, I was like, it's so much better than I remember it being. Like, the stuff is really good. And he was like, he was working on a Flutter app and was like, oh, that sounds quite cool. And I would say, like, I was just like going on about it, and I think he was getting a bit sick of it. But he then was like, oh, we're kind of exploring doing this other app. Do you want to chat about Expo again? And so I set him up with like a very simple project. And I was trying to send him instructions, but like trying to communicate this stuff sometimes is quite hard unless you're like able to just show someone. So I'd given him the project, and then I sent him like a voice note and was like, do this. And within like half an hour, he was like, oh my God, it's hot reloading on my phone right now. And this was like a fully managed app that he uploaded to Expo. Like, it did everything. But he was just like set up and running in half an hour.
Yeah, the whole EAS service, it's pretty wild how it works, how it manages the certificates, and how everything works. You said a couple of things. I took some notes. So I definitely just want to, because I found this interesting and I never saw it. You quickly mentioned the critical alerts. So for everyone interested, this is like when users are usually having their iPhone on like do not disturb or something. You can still get through that mode by setting a flag critical true in the payload of the push notification, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for Android, you said you had to write a custom module because it actually doesn't work that easy. Two questions about that. First, is that Expo module which you did, like, is it in a separate project or did you include it in the project? Because I wasn't exactly sure. And second, how does it actually work with Android? Like, what hoops do you have to jump through to like use critical alerts?
It's a great question. So the module itself sits within a repository. When we first built this as well, this was all within a monorepo, within like a monorepo of all of our code. The only other repository we had was like an infrastructure one, which manages all of our like backend infrastructure with Terraform. But like all of our server code written in Go, all of our web app, our status page app, our Zendesk app, our mobile app all sits in this one repository. That was actually very hard with Expo when we first started out, and just in the last month, we've actually ended up pulling the mobile app out into its own repository. We just found it wasn't the technology that was holding us back. It was more like the release process and trying to like manage branches and stuff in the right way when there was like multiple products being released. So we ended up pulling the mobile app out, but the native modules that we wrote all just sit alongside the rest of your mobile app code. And it works fairly well. Like in theory, you can like open up the module code without without creating your Android directories ephemerally or creating your iOS directories. But I think to get the right IDE experience and to have all the like packages bootstrapped in the right way and make it work in the most like natural way where you can just run it in the app quickly, you generally want to generate those and have it link the module into your main project. As for the critical alert stuff, this was, I think, like a trial by fire, because we went from like writing React Native and using views and I don't know, everything's like quite a happy land where it almost feels like you're writing a sample project where you're just like, oh, I need a view, and you can iterate very quickly on that stuff. But when it came to like something a bit novel that's not really talked about much, was a bit harder. So I'd done some stuff like looking up other Android apps that were maybe open source. There's like a home automation app and a blood glucose monitoring app I found that both do similar things. And I was kind of looking at their code, trying to work out how do they do this. And what we've got now is a kind of counterintuitive thing is like when you get a push notification on Android, normally what you do is your backend sends like a push notification with a title and a message and some details. And that will like go via Firebase. It'll come to your phone and your phone will display the notification. what we do instead is we actually send you what's called a data-only notification. So there's no title, there's no body in the push notification that the backend sends us. It's just a JSON blob. And generally this is designed for things like maybe you're Netflix and you want to automatically download some updates on the user's phone in the background. You can use these data-only push notifications to sort of wake up the app and then maybe enqueue a background job which will like set up the download or something. It's just like it's like the backend tells the app to wake up and do something. So what we do actually on Android is, rather than sending this title and description and sound or whatever, we send you a data-only notification which wakes the app up, and then the app looks inside the data blob, and inside the data blob is a title and description. So it's almost like a Trojan horse of just the same push notification but set up differently. But this means the app can wake up and it can do whatever it needs to do. So we've kind of gone through a couple of iterations for this, and I actually have ideas of how we might change it further in the future. But the sort of simplest version is you have an API in Android called Do Not Disturb Access, which confusingly is different to Do Not Disturb on Android. So they have this API. You'll see sometimes if you are like configuring your notification in Android, you can have channels which are like, for us, for example, you have like pages come under one channel, and then you have like on-call shifts might come under another channel, and it lets people say like, I don't want to know about, I don't know, on-call shifts if I'm in sleep or something. I don't want to be woken up by those. But alongside those channels, you can configure, do you receive those in Do Not Disturb? And that sounds a lot like, oh, that's just exactly what we need to do. But it turns out all that controls is like whether it gets displayed in Do Not Disturb. Whether it plays a sound is a completely separate thing. So this Do Not Disturb Access API is confusingly a way for your app to check the ringer mode and the volume switch, or the volume levels and the ringer switch that you've got on your phone. So if we ask for access to that, which we do like as part of onboarding to the product, we can then, in theory, get a push notification, check if you're on silent, unsilent your phone, send you the notification, and then put your phone back on silent. And there's other parts in there, like your app sending the notification is asynchronous, so you actually have to schedule a background job to re-mute your phone, and just like some confusing back and forth. But it's effectively that. It's like we will try and unsilent your phone, play the notification, and silent it again. It's not without flaws. There's things like on a work profile, you can't get access to that API, or if you have a OnePlus, they have physical mute switches, and we can't move the physical switch, so it's just like not an option in those devices. So it's the kind of thing like, I think when I worked across iOS and Android, I was like, Android's just rubbish. I think I was just like a diehard Apple person, and like I went to WWDC before. I was very, very into it. But one of those things that makes you feel very vindicated, and you're like, on iOS it's so easy. But I've come to enjoy it. Just, it's a different way of doing things.
I think I heard on another podcast somebody say that with React Native, with Android, you have more problems, but if you have a problem on iOS, it's harder to solve. So that's the difference between.
Yeah, it's that like the walls are very high on iOS, so when you hit them, they're just like hard to get over. But on Android, it's a bit more loosey-goosey, but there's more of them.
Last question regarding the alerts. If you pass this critical flag on iOS, does it trigger like this network carrier, like there's a hurricane outside alert on my phone, or does it like just do it? I don't know what that setting different. Is. Do you know, like we sometimes get this in Germany when they like, usually it's for testing. I never got something real, but usually they tell like on the radio a couple of days before, like there will be some tests, but I usually don't hear radio. And then on that day I get it and my phone like instantly burps and I'm like, what's going on?
Yeah.
It's not that sound.
It's not that sound. I think the tone is slightly different. There's a default tone. I actually thought this was I always thought this was the tone that one of our competitors, PagerDuty, was like. They've been around for quite a while. That's what I thought, that was their tone, and then we built it, and I was like, "That's the same tone." And realized it was the iOS default, which is slightly different to the emergency alert one.
Yeah, emergency. Yeah.
But something quite fun is one of our investors is a member of the band The Chainsmokers. And we kind of jokingly said, as we were like building this product, we were like, we should do some fun ringtones so that when you get paged, I don't know, whatever. And there's actually a funny clip of me sitting in my flat that my girlfriend took, where I was sitting like talking into a mini like digital synthesizer I've got, going like, "You've been paged," and trying to like modulate it and stuff, which didn't make the cut, unfortunately. But we spoke to one of our investors at the Changesmokers and kind of like, "Would you guys be up for making some sounds?" And they were like, "Yeah, of course." So our default pager sound is actually, there's 4 of them as well. There's 4 options that they made, but our default pager sound is a tune, like a few second long like ringtone that was made by one of the Changesmokers.
So cool. Nice. That's a nice little Easter egg. Probably nobody else knows about in the application. Speaking of some technical stuff again, I saw you selected Native Wind in the beginning, probably because you used it on the web already. And there was another library called Vercel SWR for like API calls. Could you explain like why you decided on those, especially like the second one?
Yeah, of course. Native Wind I'll talk about first because it's, like you said, it's fairly obvious, I guess, is we use Tailwind in the web and we're quite keen to have, the same experience and we quite enjoy it there. So, set it up there, fairly seamless. The one difference that we had from the web is most apps on most native apps kind of want to support dark mode by default, and the experience for writing dark mode with Tailwind I found was a bit suboptimal. You have to write your normal color and then write dark : your other color, which having to write that on everything just becomes very verbose and is quite annoying. So we wrote a small extra thing which sits at like the root of our app as like a color provider, and it will observe your theme, and at runtime will basically swap out some CSS variables that are relevant to the current theme. And then rather than saying like background black, you say background default or something, and just like a semantic name for the color without referring to like the specific one for a specific light or dark mode, which has worked quite nicely.
But so you could like reuse all the colors from the web and the configuration for Tailwind, pretty same?
Yeah, so we have the same Tailwind config, like the same sizing, radiuses, and things. And we've recently put a bit of an effort in, our design team have put some effort into our Figma so that all uses basically the same variables. So you can just look at a design, click on an element, and it'll tell you like text, secondary. It basically just tells you all the stuff, and you can even use one of the like Figma plugins that gives you the Tailwind code for it, so you can almost just like copy and paste the code, which is quite nice. The other library we used, SWR, I'm trying to remember, there's another library that's quite similar to this that I think is more popular in the React Native circles.
Like React Query or Tinstick, right?
Yes, React Query I think it is. I've not used that and couldn't really speak to the differences of them, but we use SWR in the web. We have a Vercel Next.js product, and SWR is a Vercel library, so they kind of recommend it as a nice option there. But we just found the experience of like writing it and the UX of using it like really nice, so we were like, let's try this on mobile. What we've got is our backend gives us like a open API generated API, so we have like a type safe version of our API, and we then have a thing that, using some like awful looking TypeScript type inference type stuff, basically gives you a way to say like, you can write a function where you just say use API, and then you give it a string, which looks very weird, but is actually type safe, and it's checking that the string you give it is one of the keys of all of the different methods we have in our API. And then it type safely then checks that the next argument you give it is any parameters that you want to pass to that API request. And that returns you an object which is like, is loading data, error, as well as a few other things. And then you can even give it like a third parameter, which is like request options that you might want. We don't use those most of the time, because most of the time you just set a default at the root level of your app, and all of your API requests inherit those defaults. But it lets you do other things like retry on particular errors, or on success do this, on error do this. And the main thing it does is it caches your requests and like handles all of that for you. So as part of that wrapper we've written, we basically told it how to map one of our type generated API requests into like a cache key. So you can look at any particular request, you know what the cache key is for it, and it basically means rather than having to like drill props down loads of different components or try and have some like parent thing that manages looking up things, you can just have each component look up the stuff it needs, and SWR will handle giving you a cached version of the same thing, or like handle multiple concurrent requests that all look quite similar. So it's been really nice. The one thing, so we've not run into this problem on mobile yet, we have somewhat run into it on our web dashboard, is because we have this very fancy types inference thing going on, we end up with all like our TypeScript compile times have started to like creep up quite a bit over time. Because you might have like a few different API requests going on in one component, and then you're doing all the things with the results of those API requests, and the type of the thing that you're using way down in a file might be inferred just based on the string looking up in a massive list of APIs. So one thing we're thinking of doing soon is actually, rather than what we do just now, which is we take an API generate, like a open API spec, convert that into like an API file, and then infer all these SWR options from that file. We could sort of skip the middleman and just automatically generate a bunch of functions which are much more explicitly typed, remove a bunch of like TypeScript guessing going on. So it's been absolutely fine on mobile. The really nice thing is, again, like Tailwind, it's the same as our web stuff, so we can just, it's much easier to context switch between the two platforms. And like generally, I think has been pretty good. There's nothing in it so far that I'm like, this is really painful and like we need to change. I'm sure performance might be a problem at some point, but it's not the sort of thing that we're like having enough problems with to like really dedicate time with.
Yeah. Speaking of differences and similarities, that brings us to a good point, which is CI/CD. I think you tried to integrate your Expo application into your standard CI/CD flow, and I think that didn't work out well in the end, right? So, what did you do? Like, what did you try, and where did you end up finally?
Yeah. So, what we started with, I mentioned earlier, we had this in our mono repo, and we have Circle CI as like our main tool that we use in our mono repo, other than like a handful of GitHub actions that were just more convenient for certain tasks. And originally this was in our mono repo, and I don't know, in the very early days, it was like no CI/CD. It was just like me randomly running ES CLI commands as needed. Then obviously that doesn't scale so much, so it started adding more CI/CD. I think a few things we found tricky. One is like build versioning, runtime versioning, that sort of thing, which are concepts in Expo, but they're concepts in other. If you write a native app as well, is like you might have 1.0.0 as like the version that users see, but then you have the build number, which is like uniquely identifies a build in for your app. But that build number always needs to be incrementing. And on Android, there's limits to how long it can be that aren't the same on iOS, and just like some annoying differences. Yeah. So what I set up originally was like build numbers are automatically set based on the timestamp at the current time. And that way they're always incrementing. It's quite nice. And they're at least also quite a good way to, you can sort of glance at it and be like, oh, that was yesterday's build or that was today's build, which is quite useful. And that was something I'd done quite similarly on mobile apps in the past. The problem that we sort of run into there is trying to think exactly. There's a number of problems, I guess, and one of them is like we had this mobile app that we deployed, but once it was deployed, we wanted to make use of Expo updates to push remote updates without having to go through a store approval. Not that we're doing dodgy stuff in our app at all, but more like, we have a bug because something's happened or someone's requested something. We're very like our web app and our Go backend are like continuously deployed. We don't have like a release. We just merge to master and everything deployed with automation for tests and checks and everything. So everyone's very used to like things happening instantly here. And like we're quite popular with customers for like, they'll ask for something and sometimes within 15 minutes we'll be like, we've built it, tested it, deployed it, and it's available for them to try. And like, I think having a mobile app was a bit of a scary thing because it's like, you might not be able to get this out for a week at best. So Expo updates and like a similar product was a bit of like we really want this. And the problem we ran into with the build versioning and stuff is like once we'd released an app into the store, you have to then have a record of that app that you can then push updates to. And I'm sure a lot of people familiar with React Native, you have this whole problem of like you have your native app, you have the JavaScript app. The JavaScript can only call stuff that is valid and in the version of the native app you're running. Otherwise, you'll get these weird errors. And like managing that is just quite hard, especially at scale. It's like if you've done a few releases, you only want to push to the ones that are compatible with your current release. And just like managing that was quite tricky. So what we'd started with originally was we would have like release branches that we'd named based on like the version that we released in the store. And what we also did is we built what we called like an RC version of the app, as well as a production version of the app. And the RC version is almost exactly like production. The only difference it has is that it is a slightly different release channel for Expo updates. So it works exactly like production. It actually had the same bundle ID, so you could only have RC or production installed, which is a bit of a problem. And it has the same push certificates and everything. So, but the main reason we had that was if you have got a change that you want to like test out before you give to people in production, RC was the way that we would do that, because Expo updates, at least at the current time, doesn't let you do targeted updates to specific people. You can't be like, I want all of the Instant.io internal people to get this update, and once that goes well, we're going to release it to everyone. I think they do have like phased releases, and they do some smart things around rolling back when things fail, but there's nothing that lets you just say like, I, Rory, want to get the latest build and try it out. So we've done this RC stuff as like a way to work around that, but honestly, just like the problem of them being the same bundle ID was quite tricky. The release branch thing was quite opaque and like hard to like see what had been deployed and what was going on. So just a few weeks ago, we moved to a new process where we pulled the mobile app out into its own repository. We set up a new thing that Expo have, I think it's in pre-release still, I can't remember, called fingerprinting, which the whole concept of is they will try and create a hash of all of the native stuff you have in your app, and then they'll basically tag your releases with that fingerprint. And whenever you want to push updates, it will only be sent to native builds that have the same fingerprint, with the aim being that like, I don't know, if you upgrade your reanimated library, for example, which relies a lot on the native side of things, you're not going to like push some incompatible change that suddenly crashes everyone's app that's on the older version that's currently in stores. So that's going fairly well so far. One other thing that we added, which I think I'll probably write a blog post about at some point, or someone else in the team might, is we use GitHub issues to track the releases that we've done. So I think some of this is suggested by Expo in their like continuous release fingerprinting documentation, and then I think other bits are things that we've built ourselves. But effectively, each time we do a release, or each time we merge to master, our CI/CD will automatically create an issue in GitHub if this is a new version. And you can then open the issue and you can use like / commands to trigger stuff to that release. So typically that's like you can do / release build, and it'll build you a new release, submit it to the stores, and you'll have it in test flight. And then if you want to then like push changes to that release, you can it generates a release branch as well, as you can cherry pick changes under that release branch. You can then go into the issue and do / release update. And then it basically gives you a view. You can open the issue in GitHub and people can visually see all the stuff that we've done to that release, and they can sort of see the timeline of it. And alongside that, Expo will do all this. Expo's GitHub integration will do some nice stuff where they'll like post the QR codes giving you a sample of the release that you've now just pushed. So people can basically scan it. They can visually scan it, but then they can actually physically scan the QR code to like try out different updates that we've done to different releases. Which we're only, I think, 3 releases into having tried out, and there's still some parts we need to work out. But we now have like a completely separate bundle ID for our staging app, so you can test it in there. That staging app can point to any environment of ours, so any of our backend environments. So you can test it against staging, the backend. You can test it against production. You can even test it against your like local development environment. So it's come a long way. I wouldn't say it's perfect still, and like realistically for us, we have one engineering team for OnCall currently that mostly own the mobile app. There's very little. We've got 4 engineering teams in total, and the other teams aren't actively working on mobile very often, if at all. So it's quite easy for us to just like iterate on our process and work on it for now. I think in the future, when we have like other teams trying to get involved and like we have to think more about like coordinating releases and stuff, it might be a bit trickier. But it feels like we've got a lot of the sort of skeleton in place of like the process that should work quite nicely. And I'm hoping that we get some more time to like flesh that out and like, kick the tires a bit before we have other people working on it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds amazing, all the processes you've set up and the GitHub flows and the commands. And I would love to have that. I would love to look at it. I think many people listening are like, wow, this is pretty amazing because, I mean, it sounds like you're a big team. You said like 4 people or how many? Or 4 teams?
We're 4 teams, and our on-call team is 5 or 6 engineers. I've done a lot of our React Native development. We had Matt and Patrick Zatorsky work with us for, I think, 3 months at the start of the year when we first were doing the mobile app. So it was sort of me and the 2 of them for most of the start of the year. But most of the time it's, 2, 3 of us working on the mobile app. Not full-time as well. It's sort of like almost a side hustle, because a lot of the time it's less of the thing that our customers are like blocked by. So it's very much like a nice to have, but a lot of the time it's like once they can be paged on it, they can create overrides, they can view their schedule and whatnot. It sort of delivers a lot of the value for them.
I mean, by now, on-call is like a big thing, isn't it? Because if I go to incident.io, I'm on the landing page, but if I click on Overview, which is like the first menu item, on-call is the first product in the list. So it's like your most important thing.
Yeah, for sure. It's I think so. We have a lot of like big customers. I think we're all very proud of, but a lot of them have been asking us like for the 2 years I've been here, and I think for longer when since the company started, it's basically been people have been like, please build an on-call product. Like I want to use your on-call product. So it's been like quite a while coming. Like this is the longest project I've worked on in secret, effectively. Like started working on this in sort of July of last year. We launched it March this year. We sort of beta testing the first couple of months of this year. And it's like a huge deal, to be honest. It's the biggest launch I've worked on. And I think so far feedback is like very good. Like we use it internally all the time, which is quite a weird thing to do, is like use your own product. But it means you're like very good at, someone reports something and you can be like, oh yeah, I hate that as well. That's really annoying. We should fix that. So you become like big advocates for the product. But yeah, I think generally like going really, really well so far, which is nice. And like most of the things that we get feedback around are like people want to use it, but they need some certain feature or something. So, we're working as quickly as possible to like build all the things that let people move over, because we'd certainly love to have people joining when they can.
It's amazing. It sounds great. It looks great. I've seen the trailer as well. There's just one last thing I wanted to ask you about, because I picked it out from one of your articles. I don't know if it was in the one we talked about, where you said, especially about debugging EAS, it can feel a bit like you're working at the operating table wearing a thick pair of gloves. I had to laugh because I was really picturing. It's kind of right. What was the problem you encountered back then? Do you still remember what it was with EAS, and how did you debug it in the end? Because I think this is something people don't often talk about. We all say EAS is great and it works great, but what if it doesn't work for you? How do you fix it?
Yeah, I think this applies to React Native as well in general, where a lot of the time, I don't know, I think having had a background in iOS as well, I sometimes know what I want to do, but know that you have to then do it with this React Native layer on top. And then sometimes having that plus the Expo layer on top of that can make it feel like you're just like, I know what I need, but it feels so far away. I had honestly quite a few problems trying to like set up our Expo config early on. And some of it was even just simple things like you eventually, like when the build fails, you get given usually like an Xcode output, which is just like, part of this is Apple and Xcode's problem is it's just like completely unreadable, and you're like scanning this many thousands of line file trying to find like one tiny error. So sometimes it was like things as simple as that are like actually just quite hard to scan and see what's wrong. Other things we had were like the monorepo setup. I think Expo have some documentation around this, and there's like a few threads you'll find where it's like, oh yeah, try this or try this, and it really felt like you were just like whack-a-moling different problems. What I ended up doing so by default when you run EAS submit, it sort of relies on your Git repository to build. It takes your Git repository, uploads it to Expo, and then they build like that artifact. That is quite problematic if your repository is more than just like your mobile app itself. So it was uploading, megabytes and megabytes, maybe even, I don't think gigabytes, I think megabytes of data. And then it runs a yarn install on Expo's side with all of that data, but certain things fail. Like I can't remember the specifics of what things were failing, but the thing we had a problem with as well is we had our mobile app, which depended on a package in our monorepo, because we're using Yarn Workspaces, which was like our API package, which is the type generated one I mentioned earlier. And that is effectively all we needed to upload. And it's like, we would upload it, it would run yarn install, and then it would fail for some completely unrelated reasons. So what I ended up doing is making use of, they've got like a EAS ignore file you can set up, which is basically like, don't upload these directories. So I ended up, what I couldn't work out is the inverse of that is I wanted a whitelist. I was just like, just take these two things. It was the kind of thing I've spent maybe half an hour trying to write, and then was just like, this isn't working. I just need to get it working. So I just ignored all the other stuff, which, it got it working. But it's now much simpler now that we're in the mobile specific repo, and it doesn't need any of that. I think the other thing, I think I might have mentioned in the blog post, is Expo, on EAS, they have a bunch of, they're basically like, they've got a virtual machine of some sort that is set up with all these dependencies, like this Android version, this Java version, this Xcode version. And they don't really give you any hand-holding around matching your computer to those versions. And depending on what other stuff you do in your computer, it's not everyone can just match Expo's version for everything. You might need some other application actually requires a different version of Java, so you can't so sometimes reproducing these problems is quite hard because your build machine doesn't match their build machine, and it's not like there's some container you can install and then build within that matches their stuff exactly.
That's right.
But the tools that I did find helped are, they have a thing where you can basically run multiple steps of their build process locally, which actually helped a ton. So the first thing you can do is, I can't remember the exact incantation, but you can run a command that's basically like, take this repository as if you're about to do an EAS build, but just take the generated stuff and put it somewhere else, and then let me debug the generated directory that you've just made. So I ended up doing that quite a lot, where I would be like running EAS build with this local flag, looking at it and being like, why is that still there? And then like going and updating the ignore file, or like doing a bit of that. It was doing a lot of like trial and error like that. And honestly, probably spent like 2 or 3 days fixing that sort of stuff. And it was a bit annoying early on, but it's the kind of thing, now that it's working, I've not touched since. So it's like, it's painful at the time. But it's also like, I didn't have to do any like distribution certificate configuration or push certificate configuration. Like I probably would have spent just as long, if not longer, doing that on iOS and Android at the start, which I didn't have to do as well. So there's sort of swings and roundabouts.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, it's annoying to put a few files in the ignore file, but good thing that this mechanism actually exists for Expo, and that you could get the job done eventually.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Rory, thank you so much for taking the time. I really love this. I really like these industry insights into projects and all the problems you encountered, and the hoops you had to jump through, and what made the project hard or easy at some points. So definitely, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing all these insights.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.
Where can people find out more about you or the OnCall app? Where should they go?
So I think I'm on Twitter is just Rory Bain, or you can email me at rorydbain@gmail.com. And you can find Incident.io just at Incident.io on most things, or incident.io to find our website. So yeah, get us there.
Cool. Awesome. I'll put all the links also to the building a multi-platform on-call mobile app article in the show notes, and all the best to making this.
Yeah. Thanks, Simon.
Catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining today's episode. My goal is to share interesting stories and insights into the world of React Native development. If you enjoy this show, please subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. And on Spotify and Apple, you can leave up to a 5-star review. Because podcasts, and especially niche podcasts like this, are hard to find, subscribing and leaving a review does help me a lot. On top of that, check out my React Native courses on galaxies.dev that cover a variety of topics from getting started to building and publishing your mobile app. Finally, you can share today's episode with a friend or colleague who would enjoy the topic of the show. If you have any questions or ideas for future episodes, find me on X or leave a comment on YouTube. And last but not least, thank you for listening and happy coding. Simon.